So welcome to the Conscient podcast, another episode from the Creative Cultural Leadership course. I've done a few. Rebecca is with me. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
So I was telling Rebecca that this podcast is about exploring the contribution of the arts to environmental awareness and action. And Rebecca is one of my colleagues here in the course, and I'll ask her to introduce herself, tell us a little bit about herself, her background, and then we'll jump into the topic at hand.
Wow, great. Hi, my name is Rebecca Mwase. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana. I am a multidisciplinary theater artist, cultural worker, and cultural organizer and facilitator. I've been making work for about 10 years, 11 years. And a significant amount of my work has been about the intersection of climate change and cultural loss, and also the sort of historical ramifications of climate change on major social moments of grief or mourning.
I'm interested in what your initial reactions are to the topic of the podcast. What does that elicit in you when somebody says, what is the role of the arts in relation to consciousness and environmental action?
Ooh, yeah. It's such a great question. I think that art is a practice of, or can be, I should say, I don't think it always is, a practice of expanding consciousness, right? That so much of what we do as artists is find relationality and connection points and then explore the possibility of a present or a future that we haven't quite attained yet. And so thinking about that in the age of the climate crisis, I think gives us a tremendous opportunity to explore and to embody possibility for engaging with the earth as it continues to change, for engaging with each other, and for doing so in ways that are more symbiotic, healthily interdependent than we currently are. And I think, the way that we interpret and tell the story of ourselves, right? Art's a way to reflect back to ourselves who we are and how we came into being, that then also offers an opportunity to shift a narrative to become more in alignment with who we want to be and how we want to operate as opposed to what is. A lot of my work is around home and belonging and the borders that keep us from that. So in my most recent piece, a lot of the work was around transformation and what is required in order to maintain connection, to transform in service to your surroundings and the work and the people that you're around. Because I think a lot of relationality allows for a mirroring to happen, and then when that mirroring happens, you're I see that something is wrong. How do I shift? And since the focus of some of that work is around healing from the trauma of systemic oppression, or healing from traumas that sort of affect our social, national consciousness, that figuring out what is the thing that is wrong, or what is the root cause of the thing that is wrong? How do you name that? How do you recognize it? What are the ways that you can apply a balm to it? How can that become embodied, right? What are the songs that we sing? What are the ways of movement? What is the spiritual container that needs to be crafted or created or maintained to stay in that continuous relationship, right? And then I think one of the things we've talked a lot about here that's really real in my work is how do you process the grief of these experiences, the grief of the climate changing, the grief of, the history of the slave trade, the grief of the loss of wetlands in Southeast Louisiana, right? How do you process that grief? And then in the processing, also find the joy and use that joy to then transform, right? That joy to be oh, okay, well, this is happening, but if we come together in this way, things can shift.
Well, that makes sense to me because I've heard you speak over the week, and you've articulated, and you're very articulate. I appreciate that, because I think people listening are looking to better understand how does one begin making the connection between art and climate change. Now, of course, they're already there because artists work on all kinds of themes, but specifically on the large, complex, multi-layered issue of climate change. What can artists do practically, and also what should they be thinking about and doing and not doing. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on advice for artists who are tackling the climate change issue, things that you might recommend they think about.
Ooh, yeah. I mean, I'm one of the artists who, the way I was trained was to look at yourself first and then see how you can connect, right, to the things around you. So I'm like, what are your stories? What is you and your family's relationship to land, to air, to water, right, to spirit? And how has that shifted because of climate circumstances? For me personally, my family was displaced by colonialism, right? And then moved to the States. We've lived in the South my whole life. And we've lived in places that have been ravaged by tornadoes and hurricanes. And so my direct relationship to climate change is that I live in New Orleans in a swamp that is because of oil and gas industry, because of the petrochemical plants, has a really high rate of cancer, has, really high rates of asthma, has a decreased quality of life because the wetlands that were cleaning the water and providing a barrier to the storms are shrinking due to this degradation. And so then I say, okay, that's the way it's directly affecting me. What do I want it to be? What do I want the difference to be? How do I want it to shift? I'd love for the wetlands to be restored. I'd love for the chemical plants to be closed. Great. So what is the information, right, that can be gathered and transmitted that could support that happening, that could support people who are experiencing that reality on the ground and could support people who aren't as familiar to understand better so that then they would have a shift in consciousness. And then I make work from that place, right? And I think figuring out what your goal is, right? It's the impetus of the work is to be in a conversation about climate change, but the goal might be to shift a particular policy, or the goal might be to bring people together to grieve, or the goal might be to practice deepening a connection to spirit inside of this context. What are you trying to achieve, and then to work from there. I don't know if that.
No, that's excellent because you use the word consciousness to raise consciousness, and there's so many different approaches to that. The art can be evocative, it can be provocative, it can be contemplative, it can be right in your face, it can be a long-term slow burn. But I agree that artists need to think through how they want to, and maybe collaborate. And this is one of the things that has been the theme of the week for me in terms of the gap for artists to meaningfully contribute to the issue. They often need to collaborate with others, either artists, but also scientists and other sectors. And that's not always easy to do. The funding structures are fairly siloed. The methodologies are different.
Access to those kinds of relationships is difficult.
Cultural difference, cultural language, there's all kinds of things that need to be considered, and yet we really need the artists to step up. And I'm not saying they're not, because they are, right? But to be even more impactful, this course is about leadership, but it's also about trying to move forward to advance the contribution of the arts and cultural sector so that they can play the role that is needed of them by society. We really need them to step up.
Right, absolutely.
But they need to be paid, they need to be work in good conditions, they need to have all the things that they would normally have, and to be supported maybe even more. So I'm a bit utopic here, but I'm also shivering because it's cold out. But it's fine. I wore short pants today.
I know, I saw you and I was like, wow,
well, because I went for a run this morning. And
okay.
But I want to thank you for something that you said a couple of days ago. You brought up the concept of, I think it's disproportionate impact. And I told you that I had not heard those two words put together before, but I think I know what you mean.
Right.
But it's really something to think about when you're creating any kind of art, and especially if you're trying to have impact, societal impact on an issue like climate change. You really have to think through those. So maybe you could talk to me a bit more about that concept and how it's applied, and maybe examples of that.
Well, so it comes out of the environmental justice community. Back in like the 80s, the U.S. government released this toxic waste and race report, and what they found was that the majority of waste incinerators and landfills and dumps were in communities of color, and that was having, a disproportionate impact on the health of those communities, leading to high cases of asthma, cancer, all of these different things. And so when I think about the art that I or anyone else is making, I think about who is impacted by this issue, who is disproportionately impacted because of their social identities, race, gender, class, sexuality, ability or disability, and then how am I speaking to, being in conversation with them in order to create whatever like imaginative possibility, right? Because for me, it's like if you work through a creative question and you're holding some understanding, because if that's not the group that you belong to for whatever reason, you're not going to have complete understanding. But if you're holding like the conceptual reality of those folks existing, and that inside of whatever climate change future you're trying to create, those folks are still going to exist and you want them to exist and you actually want them to be better off than they are now, then you're going to explore and you're going to dream in ways that hold space for them, right? I think I'm really into speculative fiction and science fiction. And inside of that, right, it's like there's a lot of work happening right now about imagining Black futures, imagining futures in which like people of color exist, in which queer people exist, because so much of our visioning process erases those folks in the future, right? And so if we imagine that like the islands in Kiribati that are currently being destroyed because of sea level rise and like nuclear waste still exist, then we're creating solutions, we're creating art, we are exploring possibilities that hold the folks who are disproportionately impacted by what's happening now.
Well, maybe we can wrap up with any final thoughts of things that you maybe have learned or retained this week that you'd like to share, because we've been through 4 of 5 days of pretty intense learning and sharing. I don't know if anything comes top of mind that you would like to share at this point.
So one of the things I think that I'm sitting with is like, I work outside of institutions, right? I'm an individual artist. And so I'm like, outside of any sort of organizational structure, I've been thinking a lot about like what are the activation possibilities for my work in relationship to climate change. And then who are the institutions that I want to partner with? So I've been thinking a lot about partnership and collaboration. I've been thinking a lot about like community partnership. So I'm like, what would it look like for me to work with a specific community in New Orleans who's experiencing this, or a specific community somewhere that's experiencing the ravages and effects of climate change, and then to amplify that so that then they either have, develop, or like are able to deepen a relationship with an institution that can actually have a tangible effect, material effect on them. I have a lot of friends who are organizers who are very much like, does it change the material conditions? Because I think often art is ephemeral, right? We can't measure or map how it changes things, but I think there is a way for that ephemeral experience, in theater at least, for my practice, can then lead to a tangible shift. And so it's like figuring out all of the components along the way that need to happen for that to exist. And so much of that is about collaboration and partnership. So much of that is about continuity and being clear about the different areas that you're working with and their role in moving something. So I'm sitting with that really strongly, and where we've had conversations about partnerships with scientists, partnerships with,
social scientists,
those kind of entities that like I've worked with before in some of my work, and it was great and I loved it, but it wasn't something that I was spearheading. Like I always end up managing the community engagement aspects of things because I'm really good with regular people, So just thinking about that, right, and what that cultivation looks like, and what it means to sort of dismantle the barriers between sort of academic people, scientists, social scientists, researchers, and the folks on the ground who are actually experiencing the things in real time.
Yeah, and who would benefit both from an aesthetic experience and some kind of material gain.
Right, and it would happen on both sides, right?
Yeah.
Like it would enrich everyone. So like where's the mutual benefit, and how can that mutual benefit actually have a higher benefit for the people who are on the front lines, right? The people who are
Well, there's a vision for the vision for the future, but also just a way of working.
Yeah,
You just say
absolutely.
that's the goal, and it unfolds through an artistic process in collaboration with, like you say, the right partners, right?
Right.
And then the right process also, so that they stay engaged, and then the community also has a voice. I like it.
Cool. Great.
Anyway, good luck.
Let's all do it together.
Thank you for your time, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claude.